The explosion ripped through the bridge of the U.S. Perseverance like the angry fist of a god. And Lieutenant Marcus Cole felt the entire ship shudder beneath his feet as he stood 3 decks below in the engineering bay. He had been elbow deep in a broken water recycler when the alarm started screaming. And for a moment, he thought it was just another drill. Another boring exercise in a journey that had already lasted 6 long months, but then the lights went red and the ship lurched sideways, and Marcus knew with terrible certainty that this was not a drill. He grabbed it, emergency comm panel, and shouted into it, asking what was happening, demanding answers from anyone who could hear him. But all he got back was static and the distant sound of screaming. Marcus ran through the corridors with his heart pounding in his chest, passing crew members who looked just as confused and terrified as he felt. And when he finally reached the central hub, he found chaos waiting for him. A young ensign grabbed his arm with shaking hands and told him the bridge was gone. Just gone, torn apart by some kind of weapon that came from the massive alien ship that had appeared out of nowhere. The captain was dead, and so was the first officer and the second officer, and basically everyone who outranked Marcus by more than a few steps. He felt his stomach drop as the reality hit him like a punch to the gut. He was one of the senior officers now, not because he was qualified or brave or special, but simply because everyone above him had died in the span of 30 seconds. The alien ship hung in space outside their windows, like a mountain made of metal and light, so large that it blocked out the stars behind it. And Marcus stared at it with his mouth hanging open. He had never seen anything so beautiful or so terrifying in his entire life. The ship was covered in flowing patterns that seemed to move and shift like living things, and it glowed with a soft purple light that made it look like something from a dream or maybe a nightmare. A communication request came through on the emergency channel, and Marcus looked around at the surviving crew members who were all staring at him with desperate eyes. Someone had to answer it. Someone had to speak for humanity in this moment, and apparently that someone was going to be a maintenance engineer who had spent the morning fixing a toilet. Marcus took a deep breath and accepted the communication. And suddenly the main screen filled with an image that made his breath catch in his throat. She was tall and slender with skin the color of pale silver moonlight, and her eyes were like twin pools of liquid gold that seemed to see right through him into his very soul. Her hair flowed around her shoulders like streams of white silk, and she wore armor that looked like it had been grown rather than made. All curves and organic shapes that hugged her form. She was the most beautiful creature Marcus had ever seen. And she was also clearly the most dangerous. The alien spoke in a voice that rang like crystal bells, and somehow Marcus could understand every word, even though he knew she was not speaking English. She introduced herself as Her Imperial Highness Alindra Velkith, 3rd Princess of the Valkyrie Dominion, and she informed him that his species had been selected for integration into the Empire. Marcus did not know what integration meant, but he was pretty sure it was not good. Alindra explained that the Valkyrie had conquered over 1,000 worlds across the galaxy, bringing order and purpose to primitive species who could not govern themselves. And now it was humanity's turn to receive this great gift. A warning shot that destroyed the bridge was merely a demonstration of power, she said, a way to establish the proper dynamic between conqueror and conquered. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest alongside the fear, and before he could stop himself, he opened his mouth and said something incredibly stupid. He asked her if she wanted some coffee. The princess stared at him with those golden eyes, and her perfect face showed something that might have been confusion. She asked him what coffee was. Marcus explained that it was a bitter drink made from roasted beans that humans consumed to help them wake up in the morning. And he said that in his culture, it was traditional. to offer a guest something to drink before discussing important matters. He was making this up as he went along, but he figured, if he was gonna die anyway, he might as well die being. Alindra tilted her head to the side like a curious bird, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. Then she did something that Marcus had not expected. She laughed. It was a small laugh, barely more than a chuckle, but it transformed her face from cold and imperious to something almost warm. She told Marcus that in her 3,000 years of existence she had never had a conquered species offer her a beverage before demanding terms of surrender. Most species begged or threatened or wept, she said, but none of them had ever offered her coffee. Marcus shrugged and said that humans were weird like that. Alindra studied him for another long moment, and then she announced that she had made a decision. Instead of immediate integration, humanity would receive a probationary period of 6 standard months. During this time, a human representative would live aboard her ship and demonstrate whether or not this species was worth preserving in any meaningful capacity, and she had chosen Marcus as that representative. He tried to protest, tried to explain that he was just an engineer, that there were smarter people and braver people and people who actually knew what they were doing. But Alindra simply smiled and said that she did not want someone smart or brave. She wanted someone interesting. And Marcus, with his coffee and his confusion and his complete lack of proper fear, was the most interesting human she had encountered in quite some time. 2 hours later, Marcus stood in a shuttle bay with a small bag of personal belongings and the weight of his entire species resting on his shoulders. The surviving crew of the Perseverance watched him go with expressions that mixed hope and pity in equal measure. He was their only chance, their unlikely champion, a man who had started his day fixing a recycler and was ending it as the ambassador for all of humanity. As the shuttle carried him toward the massive alien vessel, Marcus looked back at his ship one last time and made himself a promise he would find a way to save his people. He did not know how, and he did not know when, but he would find a way. He had to, because giving up was never something humans did well. And Marcus was not about to be the one who broke that tradition. The shuttle entered the docking bay of the Valkyrie ship, and Marcus stepped out into a new world. A world of ancient aliens and impossible technology, and a princess with golden eyes, who had laughed at his offer of coffee. His adventure was just beginning. Life aboard the Throne of Stars was nothing like Marcus had expected, and during his first week, he felt like a child who had wandered into a palace meant for giants. The ship was enormous beyond anything humans had ever built, with corridors that stretched for miles and chambers so vast that clouds actually formed near the ceilings. Everything was beautiful in a cold and perfect way. All smooth surfaces and glowing lights and technology so advanced that it seemed like magic. The Valkyrie themselves were equally impressive and equally cold. They towered over Marcus by at least 2 feet. With their silver skin and golden eyes and expressions that rarely showed any emotion at all, they moved through their ship like ghosts, silent and graceful. And they looked at Marcus the way a person might look at an interesting insect that had somehow found its way indoors. He was a curiosity to them, a primitive creature from a primitive world. And most of them did not bother to hide their contempt. The court of Princess Alindra was filled with nobles and advisors who had served the Valkyrie Empire for thousands of years, and they made it very clear that Marcus did not belong among them. They spoke over him in meetings and laughed at his questions and treated him like a pet that had somehow learned to talk. Marcus tried not to let it bother him, tried to focus on his mission of proving humanity's worth. But some nights he lay awake in his tiny quarters and wondered if he was making any difference at all. The only bright spot in his days was Alindra herself. The princess seemed genuinely interested in learning about humans, and she would summon Marcus to her private chambers to ask him questions that ranged from practical to bizarre. She wanted to know why humans needed to eat so often and why they required something called sleep and why they insisted on forming emotional bonds with small furry animals that serve no practical purpose. Marcus did his best to explain, though he had never really thought about how strange human behavior might seem to an outside observer. He told her about dogs and cats and how humans kept them as companions simply because they provided comfort and joy. Alindra found this fascinating and slightly disturbing. She asked why a species would deliberately make itself vulnerable by caring for creatures that could not contribute to survival. Marcus thought about it for a moment and then said that maybe vulnerability was not always a weakness, maybe the ability to love something without expecting anything in return was actually a kind of strength. Alindra had no response to that, but she wrote something down in a small journal she kept, and Marcus noticed that she looked at him differently after that conversation. As the weeks passed, Marcus began to find ways to make himself useful beyond just answering questions about human biology. The Valkyrie had technology that was thousands of years ahead of anything on Earth, but they had also become complacent in their superiority. When systems broke down, they simply replaced them rather than trying to understand why they had failed. Marcus approached problems differently because humans had never had the luxury of infinite resources. When a power conduit in the lower decks started malfunctioning, the Valkyrie engineers recommended replacing the entire section at enormous cost. Marcus asked if he could take a look at it first, and after much debate, Alindra gave him permission. He spent 3 days crawling through maintenance shafts and tracing power lines, and eventually he found the problem: a tiny crack in a junction box that was causing energy to leak into surrounding systems. Fixed it with some borrowed tools and a piece of wire, and the Valkyrie engineers stared at him like he had performed actual magic. The repair cost almost nothing and took a fraction of the time a replacement would have required. Word of his success spread through the ship, and soon other departments were asking for the humans' help with their own stubborn problems. Marcus found himself consulting on everything from navigation software to food preparation systems, and each time he brought a fresh perspective that the Valkyrie had never considered. He was not smarter than them, not by a long shot, but he was different, and sometimes different was exactly what was needed. Alindra watched his progress with growing interest, and their conversations began to change in subtle ways. She stopped asking about humanity as if it were a subject to be studied and started asking about Marcus himself. She wanted to know about his childhood on Earth and his family, and the dreams he had once held before he ended up on a spaceship far from home. Marcus found himself opening up to her in ways he had not expected. He told her about his mother who had died when he was young and his father who had worked 2 jobs to keep them fed. He told her about the night he had first looked up at the stars and felt a longing so deep that it ached in his chest. Told her that he had joined the space program not because he wanted glory or adventure, but because he wanted to see what was out there, to know that the universe was bigger and stranger and more wonderful than anything he could imagine. Alindra listened to every word with those golden eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light of her chambers. She told him that no one had ever spoken to her like this before. Everyone in her life wanted something from her, power or favor or influence, and every conversation was a careful dance of manipulation and strategy. But Marcus wanted nothing except to talk, to share, to connect. She did not understand why that felt so precious, but it did. One evening she asked him what he dreamed about when he slept. Marcus was caught off guard by the question and asked what she meant. Alindra explained that the Valkyrie did not sleep the way humans did, They entered a meditative state called Velthon that allowed them to rest their bodies while remaining aware of their surroundings. The concept of true unconsciousness, of surrendering control completely, was alien to her. She had read that humans experienced something called dreams during sleep. Vivid hallucinations that their minds created without conscious direction. And she found the idea both terrifying and fascinating. Marcus tried to explain dreams as best he could. He said they were like stories that your brain told itself, mixing memories and fears and hopes into strange narratives that often made no sense at all. Sometimes dreams were wonderful, and sometimes they were frightening, and sometimes they were just weird. Lindra asked if he could control what he dreamed about. Marcus laughed and said no. That was the whole point. Dreams came unbidden from somewhere deep inside, and you just had to go along for the ride. The princess was quiet for a long time after that. She said that the idea of letting her mind wander without direction sounded dangerous, like leaving a door unlocked in a house full of enemies. But she also admitted that part of her envied the ability to let go so completely, to trust the universe enough to become vulnerable. Marcus smiled and said that trust was something humans learned early. They had to trust their parents and their friends, and eventually their own hearts. It did not always work out well, but the alternative, living without trust at all, seemed worse. Lindra looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. She said that he was very strange for a primitive creature. Marcus grinned and said that he would take that as a compliment. She did not correct him. 3 months had passed since Marcus arrived on the throne of stars, and he had fallen into a routine that felt almost comfortable despite the strangeness of his surroundings. He spent his mornings helping the engineering teams with whatever problems they could not solve on their own. He spent his afternoons learning about Velkari culture and history from the ship's vast archives, and he spent his evenings in conversation with Alindra, talking about everything and nothing until he could barely keep his eyes open. Those evening talks had become the best part of his day, though he would never admit that to anyone. The princess had a mind like nothing he had ever encountered, sharp and curious and capable of holding 1,000 thoughts at once. She challenged him and questioned him and sometimes made him feel like the dumbest person in the room. But she also listened when he spoke and considered his words carefully. Marcus had started to look forward to their conversations with an eagerness that surprised him. He told himself it was just because she was interesting, just because she was his only real friend on this giant alien ship. But late at night, when he lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling, he knew that was not entirely true. He thought about her more than he should. He noticed the way her silver hair caught the light, and the way her golden eyes crinkled slightly when she found something amusing. He noticed the graceful way she moved and the melodic sound of her voice and the rare warmth in her expression. When she looked at him, Marcus was falling for an alien princess, and he knew it was the stupidest thing he had ever done in a life full of stupid decisions. She was immortal, and he was going to die in maybe 60 years if he was lucky. She was royalty, and he was an engineer who fixed toilets. She was from a species that had conquered 1,000 worlds, and he was from a species that was currently on probation. There was no future in these feelings, no happy ending waiting somewhere down the road. But the heart does not care about logic, and Marcus found himself dreaming about her almost every night. The dreams were vivid and strange, the way dreams always are sometimes. They were walking together through gardens that did not exist, talking about things he could never remember when he woke. Sometimes they were standing on the bridge of a ship facing some great danger together, side by side against the darkness, and sometimes in dreams that made his face flush hot when he woke. They were closer than friends should ever be. He never told her about these dreams, of course. He was not that stupid, but he could not control what his sleeping mind chose to create. And so the dreams continued night after night, It was on a night like any other that everything changed. Marcus had stayed up too late reading about Velkari military history, trying to understand how their empire had grown so powerful. His eyes had grown heavy and his head had started to nod. And eventually, he had given up and collapsed into his bunk without even changing out of his clothes. He fell asleep almost instantly, and the dreams came as they always did this time. He was in a great hall made of crystal and light, and Alindra stood before him in a gown that flowed like water. She was smiling at him, really smiling, not the polite expression she wore at court, but something genuine and warm. He reached out to touch her face, and she leaned into his hand, and he felt happier than he had ever felt in his waking life. And then he started talking. Marcus had always been a sleep talker. Ever since he was a kid, his mother used to tell stories about finding him in the middle of the night having full conversations with no one at all. He had never been able to control it, and he had learned to just accept it as one of his many quirks, but he had never considered what would happen if someone was listening. Alindra had been passing through the crew quarters on her way to the meditation chambers when she heard a voice coming from Marcus's room. The door was not fully closed, and sound carried easily in the quiet corridor. At first, she thought he was awake and talking to someone on a communication device. She stopped outside his door to listen, curious about who he might be speaking with at such a late hour, but the words she heard made her freeze in place. Marcus was saying her name, not her title, not Princess or Your Highness, but her actual name, spoken in a soft and gentle voice that she had never heard from anyone before. Alindra, he mumbled, shifting in his sleep. You are so beautiful when you argue with me. The princess felt something strange happen in her chest, a tightening sensation that she did not recognize. She pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside, expecting him to wake at any moment and be embarrassed. But Marcus remained deeply asleep, his eyes moving rapidly beneath their lids, lost in whatever dream had captured him. I know you think humans are strange, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, but I think you are wonderful and stubborn and perfect, and I wish I could tell you that when I am a wacky. Lindra stood over him and watched his sleeping face, and for the first time in 3,000 years, she did not know what to do. Velkari culture, the speaking of someone's true name was sacred. It was reserved for bonded mates, for those who had pledged their souls to each other for eternity. No one spoke another's name casually or carelessly. And to hear it in this context, in this intimate unconscious confession, felt like witnessing something she was not meant to see. And yet she could not look away. She could not make herself leave. Marcus smiled in his sleep and said her name again. And Alindra felt the strange tightening in her chest grow stronger. She had been alive for 3 millennia. She had seen empires rise and fall. She had commanded fleets and conquered worlds and watched stars die, but she had never experienced anything like this moment. Standing in a dark room listening to a human dream about Hera, chuckle escaped her lips before she could stop it. It was a sound she had not made in centuries, a genuine expression of something that felt dangerously close to joy. She pressed a hand to her chest, as if she could push the feeling back inside where it belonged. What are you doing to me? She whispered to the sleeping human who could not hear her. Marcus rolled over and mumbled something about coffee. And despite everything, Alindra felt herself smile. She stayed for a few more minutes, watching him sleep, watching this strange, vulnerable creature who had somehow become important to her. Then she slipped out of the room as quietly as she had entered. Closing the door behind her, she did not tell him what she had heard. She was not ready for that conversation, and she suspected he was not ready either, but something had shifted between them. Something fundamental and irreversible. Alindra walked through the corridors of her ship and felt for the first time in her long life that she did not know what the future held, and somehow that uncertainty did not frighten her. It felt like hope. The change in Alindra was subtle at first. So subtle that even Marcus did not notice it immediately. She smiled more often during their conversations. Genuine smiles that reached her golden eyes. She found excuses to spend more time with him, claiming she needed his perspective on this issue or his opinion on that matter. And sometimes, when she thought he was not looking, she would watch him with an expression that seemed almost tender. Marcus noticed eventually, and it made his heart do strange things in his chest, but he did not dare hope that it meant what he wanted it to mean. He was just a human after all. And she was a princess of an ancient empire. Whatever warmth she showed him was probably just curiosity or amusement, or some emotion he could not even comprehend. He told himself not to read too much into it, told himself to focus on his mission, but it was getting harder to remember why he was here when all he could think about was her. The Valkyrie High Council had noticed the changes too, and unlike Marcus, they were not pleased. Alindra had begun questioning decisions that she would have accepted without comment before. She asked why certain species needed to be conquered when they posed no threat. She wondered aloud if there might be other ways to expand the empire besides force. She spoke of humans with something that sounded dangerously close to respect, and the council members exchanged worried glances whenever she did. Her elder siblings were the first to act. Prince Valthar, the firstborn, requested a private audience with his sister and warned her that her behavior was being watched. He told her that their father, the emperor, had received reports about her fondness for the human pet, and he was not happy. Alindra kept her expression carefully neutral and asked what exactly the emperor expected her to do. Duvalthar's golden eyes were cold as he replied he expected her to remember who she was and where her loyalties lay. He expected her to stop treating a primitive creature as if it were her equal, and he expected her, when the time came, to do her duty without hesitation. Alindra asked what that meant, and her brother smiled a smile that held no warmth at all. The probationary period was nearly over. He explained in less than 3 months, the Valkyrie fleet would arrive at Earth to begin the harvest. The humans would be stripped of their resources, their planet drained of everything valuable, and the survivors would be distributed across the empire as a labor force. This was what integration had always meant. This was what it meant for every species that joined the Valkyrie Dominion, and the emperor wanted Alindra to prove her loyalty by executing the human ambassador personally in front of the entire court, as a demonstration that she had not forgotten her place after her brother left. Alindra sat alone in her chambers for a very long time. She thought about everything she had learned in her 3,000 years of life. She thought about the empire she had served and the world she had helped conquer, and the countless species she had watched be absorbed into the dominion. She had never questioned it before. Conquest was simply what the Valkyrie did, what they had always done, what they would continue to do until they ruled the entire galaxy. But now she thought about Marcus and his stubborn hope and his ridiculous offer of coffee. She thought about his dreams and his laughter and the way he looked at her as if she were not a princess or a conqueror, but simply a person. And she thought about 8 billion humans on a small blue planet who had no idea what was coming for them. For the first time in her immortal life, Alindra felt something she could not name. It sat in her chest like a weight, heavy and uncomfortable. Later, she would recognize it as shame. Marcus found out the truth 3 days later. He had been digging through the ship's archives, searching for information about previous species that had been integrated into the empire. He told himself it was research, that understanding the process would help him prepare humanity for whatever came next. But what he found made his blood run cold. Integration was not a partnership or an alliance. It was not even slavery in the traditional sense. It was the complete and systematic dismantling of a species' identity The Valkyrie did not just conquer worlds. They consumed them. They took everything of value, materials and technology and art and history, and they scattered the surviving populations across their empire where they would forget their origins. Within a few generations, Earth would be stripped bare. Humanity would cease to exist as a people. Everything Marcus had been working for, all his efforts to prove humanity's worth, had been pointless from the very beginning. He stormed into Alindra's chambers without waiting for permission, and she could see from his face that he had learned the truth. They stared at each other across the room, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Marcus asked her if she had known. Had she known all along what was going to happen to his world, to his people, to everything he loved? Alindra's voice was quiet when she answered, yes. She had known from the very first moment she saw his ship floating helpless in space. Had known when she offered the probationary period, and when she brought him aboard, and when she spent all those evenings talking with him about dreams and hope and trust. She had known. And she had said nothing. Marcus felt something break inside him. He asked her why. Why she had let him believe there was a chance. Why she had made him care about her when she was planning to destroy everything he was. Alindra stood and walked toward him, and he saw something in her eyes that he had never seen before. It looked like pain. She told him that when she first brought him aboard, she had planned to study him like any other specimen from a soon-to-be conquered world, but then something had changed. He had changed her, with his strange human ways and his impossible optimism, and the sound of her name spoken in dreams he did not even remember. She did not want to harvest Earth anymore. She did not want to see humanity scattered and forgotten. She did not want to lose him. Marcus demanded to know what she expected him to do with that information. She had just told him that his planet was doomed and his people were already dead, and nothing he did would make any difference. What possible good could her feelings do now? Alindra reached out and took his hand. Her silver skin was cool against his, and her golden eyes burned with an intensity that took his breath away. She told him that she did not know what to do. For 3,000 years, she had known exactly who she was and what she was supposed to do. But now everything was uncertain. She only knew one thing for certain. She was not going to let Earth fall. She was not going to let him be taken from her. And if that meant standing against her own empire, against her own family, against everything she had ever known, then so be it. Marcus looked at her for a long time. He saw the fear in her eyes and the determination beneath it. Saw an ancient being who had just discovered that everything she believed might be wrong. He saw someone who was choosing to change. Even though it terrified her, he squeezed her hand and asked her what they were going to do. Alindra smiled. And for the first time, it was not the smile of a princess. It was the smile of a rebel. She said they were going to save his world, and then they were going to change the Empire forever. The Emperor's fleet arrived at Earth on a morning that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. 7,000 warships dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, each one carrying enough firepower to crack a planet in half. They hung in the darkness like a wall of metal and death. And the people of Earth looked up at their sky and knew that the end had come. Marcus stood on the bridge of the Throne of Stars and watched his homeworld. Through the view screen, he could see the blue oceans and green continents, the swirling white clouds that had fascinated him as a child. Somewhere down there, his father was probably looking up at the sky, wondering what those strange lights meant. He had not spoken to his father in almost a year. He might never speak to him again. Alindra stood beside him, and her hand brushed against his in a gesture that was meant to comfort them both. The last few weeks had been a blur of secret planning and careful preparation. They had identified officers and crew members who might be sympathetic to their cause, soldiers who had grown tired of endless conquest and wondered if there might be another way. It was not a large group, maybe a tenth of the ship's complement, but it would have to be enough. The Emperor himself was not present, choosing to watch the harvest from the safety of his throne world. But Prince Velthor commanded the fleet, and he had made it clear that he expected his sister to fulfill her duty today. The execution of the human ambassador was scheduled for exactly noon. Ship time after that the harvest would begin. Marcus had suggested running, taking the throne of stars and fleeing to some distant corner of the galaxy where the Empire could not find them. But Alindra had refused. Running would save them, but it would doom Earth. And she was not willing to purchase her happiness at the cost of 8 billion lives. If they were going to do this, they were going to do it right. They were going to stand and fight. The bridge crew went about their duties with the quiet efficiency of professionals who had served together for centuries. Most of them did not know what was about to happen. Most of them still believed that today would be just another harvest, just another world consumed by the endless hunger of the Empire. At exactly 1 minute before noon, Alindra walked to the center of the bridge and opened a communication channel to every ship in the fleet. Her brother's face appeared on the main screen, golden eyes bright with anticipation. He asked if she was ready to prove her loyalty. Alindra smiled at him, and it was not a kind smile. She told him that she was ready to do exactly that, and then she began to speak. Her voice rang out across 7,000 ships, broadcast to millions of Velkhari who had never questioned the rightness of their conquests. She spoke of the empire they had built and the species they had destroyed, and the stagnation that had crept into their civilization like a slow poison. She spoke of humans and their strange ways, their dreams and their hope and their stubborn refusal to surrender even when all logic said they should. She spoke of Marcus and what he had taught her about vulnerability and trust, and the courage it took to love something you might lose. And finally she spoke of choice. For 3,000 years she had done what was expected of her. She said she had conquered and destroyed, and never once asked if it was right. But today she was choosing something different. Today she was choosing to stand with humanity against her own empire. Today she was choosing hope over conquest, love over duty, change over tradition, and she invited anyone who felt the same way to stand with her. Prince Velthor's face twisted with rage as he screamed for her arrest. But before his orders could be carried out, something remarkable happened all across the fleet. Ships began to break formation, not many at first, just a handful of vessels whose commanders had grown weary of endless war. But then more followed, and more after that, until nearly 300 ships had moved to join Alindra's rebellion. It was not enough to match the Emperor's forces. Was not even close, but it was a start. The battle that followed would be remembered for 1,000 years. Alindra's small fleet formed a defensive line around Earth while the Empire's armada advanced like a wave of fire. Ships exploded in brilliant flowers of light and debris scattered across the void. Marcus worked frantically at a communication station, coordinating with Earth's hastily assembled defense forces. The humans did not have much. A few hundred ships that were hopelessly outmatched by Velkhari technology, but they fought anyway. Because that was what humans did. They threw themselves into the battle with a ferocity that shocked even their alien allies. Human pilots rammed their ships into enemy vessels. When their weapons failed, human commanders sacrificed themselves to buy time for civilian evacuations. Human soldiers died by the thousands, and more kept coming, refusing to give up even when victory seemed impossible. Prince Velthor had expected a quick victory. What he got instead was the bloodiest battle in Velkhari history. As the hours passed, the tide began to turn. The rebels' desperate courage inspired others to defect, and the Empire's numerical advantage slowly eroded. More importantly, word of the battle spread across the galaxy. Other conquered species watched the broadcasts with growing hope. Humans could stand against the Velkhari. Maybe they could too by the time the sun set on Earth's western hemisphere. The Emperor's fleet was in retreat. They had lost over 2,000 ships, and Prince Vulthar himself had been captured when his flagship's engines failed. Earth was damaged, but alive humanity had survived. Marcus found Alindra in the aftermath, standing alone on an observation deck and looking out at the stars. Her fleet was scattered and broken. Her family had disowned her, and she could never return to the life she had known. She had given up everything for a species she had met less than a year ago, for a man she had found. Talking in his sleep, Marcus walked up beside her and did not say anything for a long time. Finally, Alindra spoke. Without looking at him, she told him that she had heard him. That night in his quarters, she had stood outside his door and listened to him dream about her. Marcus felt his face grow hot with embarrassment and something else. Something that felt like hope. He asked her why she had never said anything. Alindra turned to face him, and her golden eyes were soft in a way he had never seen before. She told him that she had not been ready. Then she had not understood what she was feeling or what it meant, but she understood now. Marcus asked her what exactly she understood. Alindra reached out and touched his face, her cool silver fingers tracing the line of his jaw. She told him that humans had a custom where they pressed their lips together to show affection. She had read about it in the archives and found it strange and somewhat unhygienic, but she was willing to try it if he was willing to teach her. Marcus laughed, a real laugh that came from somewhere deep in his chest. He told her that it was called a kiss, and then he showed her how it was done when they finally separated. Alindra's eyes were wide with wonder. She said she understood now why humans made such a fuss about this particular custom. It was quite pleasant. Marcus grinned and said that was just the beginning. There was a lot more about humans he could teach her if she was interested. Alindra smiled and said she was very interested indeed. They stood together on the observation deck as Earth turned slowly beneath them. Battered but unbroken behind them, the remnants of two fleets drifted in space, proof that the galaxy had changed forever somewhere across the stars. Other species were waking up to the possibility that the Velkari Empire was not invincible. Somewhere, hope was spreading like fire, and in the quiet of the moment, an alien princess and a human engineer held each other and looked toward a future that neither of them could have imagined. It would not be easy. Marcus knew there would be more battles to fight and more sacrifices to make. The Emperor would not accept this defeat, and the Empire would strike back eventually. But for now, in this moment, he had everything he needed. He had his world safe beneath them. He had his people alive and free, and he had Alindra, the princess who had changed everything because she heard him speak her name in a dream. Whatever came next, they would face it together because that was what humans did. And now, apparently, it was what Velkari did too, at least the ones who had learned to dream.